In this episode, we build the skill of describing risk ingredients in a way that is accurate, specific, and useful for decisions, rather than vague, dramatic, or overly technical. The title includes 4 words that people often mix together: threats, events, vulnerabilities, and impacts. When those terms get blurred, teams argue about risk without realizing they are talking about different things, and they end up either overreacting or ignoring real problems. Engineering precision means you can separate these ideas cleanly, connect them in a logical chain, and describe them at the right level of detail for the system you are assessing. You are not trying to sound smart. You are trying to be clear enough that different people can evaluate the same situation and reach similar conclusions. Precision also helps you avoid the common beginner trap of treating security as a list of scary possibilities, because every system has endless possible bad outcomes. Instead, you learn to identify the specific pathways that could realistically lead to harm and the specific controls that break those pathways. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Start with definitions in plain language, because clarity begins with shared meaning. A threat is a source of potential harm, which could be a person, a group, a process failure, a natural condition, or a technical fault that could cause damage if it interacts with the system in the wrong way. An event is something that happens, like a phishing attempt, a software crash, a power outage, or a misconfiguration change, and events can be malicious, accidental, or environmental. A vulnerability is a weakness that makes harm easier, such as a software flaw, a weak process, an overly broad permission, or missing monitoring coverage. An impact is the consequence if the event succeeds in causing harm, such as loss of data confidentiality, loss of service availability, loss of integrity in records, financial loss, or harm to mission outcomes. These definitions matter because they help you avoid blaming the wrong thing or fixing the wrong layer. If you confuse a threat with a vulnerability, you might spend time trying to eliminate the threat source rather than reducing the weakness that makes the system susceptible. If you confuse an event with an impact, you might treat every alert as a disaster or treat real harm as routine noise. Engineering precision also means you can connect these terms into a chain that explains how risk happens. A threat source, such as an attacker or a careless user, may trigger an event, such as an intrusion attempt or a mistaken deletion. The event only becomes harmful if a vulnerability exists that allows the event to succeed, such as weak authentication, insufficient access controls, or lack of safeguards around critical actions. If the vulnerability is exploited or activated, the result is an impact, which may include downtime, data exposure, corruption of records, or disruption of a mission workflow. This chain helps you reason clearly because you can ask where the chain can be broken. You can reduce exposure to threats. You can reduce the likelihood of events. You can remove or reduce vulnerabilities, and you can limit impact through resilience and recovery. Precision is therefore not only about labeling. It is about mapping cause and effect so mitigation choices become obvious. Now focus on threats with precision, because the word threat is often used as a catch-all for anything scary. In engineering thinking, a threat is best described with attributes that make it relevant to your system. For human threats, those attributes include capability, intent, and access, meaning what the actor can do, what they want, and whether they can reach your system. For non-human threats, attributes include frequency, severity, and conditions, like how often power fluctuations happen in a region or how likely a given component is to fail under heat. If you say the threat is hackers, that is not precise enough to guide decisions because it includes too many different behaviors and skill levels. If you say the threat is credential theft targeting remote access accounts, you have narrowed it to something you can design against with specific controls. Precision does not require naming a specific attacker group. It requires describing the threat in terms that match your system's exposure and weaknesses. That is how you avoid building defenses for imaginary problems while missing defenses for common ones. Events require similar discipline, because an event is not just something bad that might happen. It is a specific occurrence with conditions and triggers. For example, A failed login attempt is an event, a software patch deployment is an event, and a database backup restore is an event. Some events are routine and benign, and some events are signals of possible attack or failure. Precision means you can describe events in terms of what actually happens in the system, such as a user receives a deceptive email, clicks a link, and enters credentials into a fake page, or an administrator applies a configuration change that inadvertently opens an access path. By describing events concretely, you make it easier to define detection and response, because you can say what you would observe if the event occurs. Events also connect naturally to timelines, which matters for response planning, because some events unfold quickly and some unfold slowly. When you describe events precisely, you are setting yourself up to reason about MTD and MTT are later without getting lost in abstractions. Vulnerabilities are where many risk discussions become messy, because people often reduce vulnerability to software bugs only, when in reality vulnerabilities can be technical, procedural, or organizational. A vulnerability is any weakness that increases the likelihood an event leads to harm or increases the potential impact of that harm. Weak authentication, missing multi-factor requirements, overly permissive roles, unpatched software, and insecure defaults are obvious examples. Less obvious examples include lack of asset inventory, because if you do not know what systems you have, you cannot patch or monitor them reliably, and that weakness can be exploited by both attackers and accidents. Another example is unclear ownership, because if no one is responsible for a component, failures go unaddressed and vulnerabilities persist. Engineering precision means you do not label everything a vulnerability. You identify the specific weakness, where it exists, and how it contributes to the risk chain. That allows mitigations to be targeted rather than generic. Impacts need precision too, because impact is often treated as a dramatic label rather than a measurable consequence. In a system context, impact should be described in terms of what the mission loses and for how long, what data is affected and how, and what secondary consequences follow. For example, confidentiality impact might mean that sensitive records become accessible to unauthorized parties, which could trigger legal reporting obligations and loss of trust. Integrity impact might mean that records are altered, leading to incorrect decisions, wrong billing, or unsafe outcomes if the records affect physical actions. Availability impact might mean users cannot access a service, which could delay critical workflows and create cascading delays across dependent systems. Precision means you describe the impact in a way that stakeholders can recognize, such as this outage prevents processing of a certain transaction type for 4 hours, or this integrity failure could lead to incorrect reporting decisions. You do not need perfect numbers, but you need a clear picture of what is harmed and why it matters. An engineering approach also demands that you separate impact from likelihood, because beginners often mix them when they say something like it is high impact and likely without describing either carefully. Likelihood depends on exposure, threat capability, event probability, and vulnerability presence. Impact depends on what assets are affected and what consequences follow. If you confuse them, you might ignore a low-impact but highly likely issue that causes constant disruption, or you might ignore a low-likelihood but catastrophic issue that needs resilience planning. Precision means you can say something like the likelihood is moderate because the system is exposed and credentials are a common target, but the impact is high because compromise would allow access to regulated data. Or you can say the likelihood is high for minor outages, but the impact is manageable because the system has reliable failover. This separation helps leaders and engineers discuss trade-offs honestly, such as investing to reduce likelihood versus investing to reduce impact. It also makes documentation more defensible because each risk statement has clear components. To identify these elements systematically, you need a disciplined method of observation rather than guesswork. You look at the system's purpose, its data, its users, its interfaces, and its dependencies, because those features shape which threats and events are plausible. You also look at operational realities like change frequency, patch processes, access provisioning practices, and monitoring coverage, because many vulnerabilities are created by routine operations. The goal is to identify what is realistic for this system, not what is theoretically possible for any system. A beginner can do this by asking structured questions, such as where can someone interact with the system? Where does the system trust something external? and what happens when a component fails. Those questions naturally produce threat sources, event types, vulnerability candidates, and impact narratives. Precision comes from connecting answers to the system's actual architecture and workflow rather than generic fears. Another hallmark of engineering precision is avoiding ambiguous language that hides uncertainty. Words like compromised, breached, and hacked are often used loosely, but they can mean very different things, from a single stolen password to a full control takeover. Precision means you specify what kind of access is gained, what privileges are involved, and what actions become possible. Similarly, saying a system is vulnerable without specifying how it is vulnerable leaves too much room for interpretation. Instead, you describe the weakness and how it could be exploited, such as weak role separation allows a user to perform administrative actions that should be restricted. When you write risk statements this way, you make them testable because someone can verify whether the weakness exists and whether the described action is possible. This is how risk management becomes evidence-based rather than opinion-based. Precision also helps prevent a subtle problem, treating controls as if they eliminate risk rather than shifting it. For example, a control might reduce likelihood by making an event harder, but it might also increase complexity and introduce new failure modes. Engineering precision encourages you to describe residual risk, meaning what remains after controls, and to recognize changed risk, meaning new risks introduced by the control itself. If you add a complex monitoring system, you might reduce MTD but increase operational burden and create risk of misconfiguration. If you add strict access controls, you might reduce unauthorized access but increase the risk of lockouts that affect availability. Precision does not mean being pessimistic. It means being honest about how systems behave. This honesty supports better decisions because it allows planning for both the benefits and side effects of security measures. The takeaway is that identifying threats, events, vulnerabilities, and impacts with engineering precision is the foundation for credible risk analysis and credible mitigation choices. When you separate these terms, connect them in a causal chain, and describe them in system-specific language, you prevent confusion and improve decision-making. You also create risk statements that can be tested, discussed, and updated as the system changes, which is essential for lifecycle risk management. Precision keeps risk management from turning into an endless list of generic worries and instead turns it into a practical map of how harm could happen and where defenses should be placed. If you practice this consistently, you will be able to explain risk to engineers without losing rigor and to leaders without losing meaning. That is the kind of clear, defensible thinking that security engineering depends on.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.